had a Hungarian tutorial from a lovely woman who came back to make sure that I pronounce the words correctly if I'm going to pronounce them. So the word is verbokos, and the accent on the first syllable. So thank you, wherever you are. When Bartók was born in 1881, Hungary was this complicated ethnic melange. And as you see, it was this mixture of ethnicities. You had the Magyar, thank you. Majority there in the center of the country, surrounded by the Slovaks and the Ruthenians and the Romanians and the Serbs and the Croats. And over the course of the late 19th century, as he came of age, there was a rising tide of nationalism, and he was swept up in it. And he became ever more conscious of the need to be fully Hungarian as he was growing up. When he was 18 years old in 1899, he was invited to go to the Vienna Conservatory. And this, of course, was a great honor, but in keeping with these nationalistic leanings and at the strong urging of his friend Ernő Daknani, he decided to go to the Budapest Academy instead. And although it was ostensibly a Hungarian institution, the leading lights were all German at that time. And he and Daknani and Kodály all studied with the same gentleman whose name was Hans von Kessler, who was German. He was a conductor, he was a composer of some note, and he schooled them in this very rigorous German school of music making. And so he learned to love Bach, he learned to love Beethoven, but he still had this strong sense of himself as Hungarian and the need to reroute Hungarian music in a different direction in the 20th century. And so he took classes on the side from a gentleman named Molnar in all of these verbokos styles, and he also took to wearing exclusively Hungarian garb around that time, and speaking exclusively Hungarian. And although he, like everybody else, spoke German, he grew incensed when people decided that they didn't want to speak their native language. And he wrote to his mother and his sister back in Pozsona, and he said, "Speak Hungarian between yourselves. How ashamed of myself I should be if, for instance, in Pozsona, or perhaps later in Budapest, an acquaintance who knows my way of thinking visits me and by chance hears you speak German between yourselves or even to me. He would think me a hypocrite. As for you addressing me in German, well, not even as a joke do I want this. What I am asking, you must do." So, in the spirit of this Hungarian fervor that he was in, the first piece that he wrote that really catapulted him to celebrity in his native Budapest was a 20-minute tone poem that he called Kossuth, after Kossuth Lajos, who was a zealous 19th century politician and very upset with this parliamentary relationship with the Habsburg Empire. And so in 1848, he declared himself the president of an upstart, breakaway Magyar republic. And in 1849, the Austrians sent in the army and they quashed this rebellion. They sent him off into exile, and there he remained over the remaining course of his life until he died. And after he died in 1894, his body was brought back to Budapest and given an heroic burial. And so, in line with his nationalistic leanings, Bartók wrote this piece, which was really it's a tone poem in the style of Richard Strauss, really, which tells the story of this ill-fated revolution of 1849, 1848, that period. And his training was German, so the language of it is, he has this verbokos style of writing, which is troweled on top of an essentially German foundation. So you hear a lot of Wagner in the music, and particularly a lot of Strauss. He loved Ein Heldenleben, which was written in 1898, I believe, and he had made a piano arrangement and played it quite a lot. And so, in the writing of Kossuth, Lajos, Kossuth, Lajos, whatever. As they used to say, I work alone. Anyway, it begins with a portrait, a musical portrait, a leitmotif, which represents Kossuth himself. And I will play that for you. And as you'll hear, it's in this very verbal push style. So you hear in those opening bars these short, long Hungarian speech rhythms and these open fifths, which sound like gypsy bagpipes rebounding back and forth between the cellos and the basses. And in the third bar, we have this tune, which is laced in this dotted rhythms, and there's this undercurrent of the alazopa rhythm, the bum, 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 bum. And within a few bars, we meet his wife. And her tune also is laced with all of these Hungarian verbal push mannerisms. And it tells us subliminally, intuitively, that she is a loyal Hungarian Brunhilde to his heroic Hungarian Siegfried. Cinematic quality to this piece, and we hear him next ruminating over the political situation and deciding that the time has come to rally the loyal Hungarian lads to the cause of revolution. And so this next section is Kossuth as a sort of Hungarian Patrick Henry. And of course, all hell breaks loose, and within about 10 minutes, the Austrian army comes marching in and quashes this rebellion. And they are represented by a fairly grotesque thematic transformation of the Austrian national anthem. Here, and as you see there, in true Straussian style, he has depicted the defeat of Kossuth by taking this leitmotif and turning it upside down so that we know that he has been literally dumped onto his head. And at the end, we have another thematic transformation, a dirge-like rendition of Liszt's Second Piano Rhapsody, which blends into a very audibly influenced version of Siegfried's Funeral March. so you can roll the credits on this movie. This was a big success for him. It was premiered in Budapest in January of 1904 to resounding ovations and critical acclaim. And a little bit earlier that same season, his friend Ernu Naknani had his second symphony premiered to great acclaim. But now the critics were turning in his direction, and they were saying things like, in Bartok there is something deliberate and willful that springs from the depths of artistic conviction. Naknani proceeds in the footsteps and the forms of the German masters Beethoven and Brahms, and we will hear that clearly on Tuesday evening in the final piece of the program in this very Brahmsian piano quintet that he wrote just before that. But Bartok creates form according to Hungarian feeling, wild, luxuriant, rhapsodic, not so sober and symmetrical that it requires the rules of a German symphony. And so he must have been happy at this time because he was the Hungarian composer of choice, and his career was now established and beginning to soar. But I assume that somewhere in the depths of his Hungarian soul, he was also feeling like he had perhaps pulled a fast one on the public and on the critics, because again, he had achieved this portrait of this great Hungarian hero by lathering layers of Verbompos mannerisms over what was essentially a Germanic foundation. And then a little bit later that same season of 1904, he was on vacation in Slovakia, and he got to see this edifice that he had constructed come toppling down around him, pushed over by a shy Transylvanian maid whose name was Lidi Doja. And he was in one room, she apparently was in the next, she was tidying up, and she was singing to herself an old Hungarian song called Piros Alma, which means the red apple. And as he listened to it, he became transfixed by this unfamiliar song, this old antique music. And he grabbed a piece of music paper and he wrote it down. And a little bit later that same season, he made an arrangement for soprano and piano, which sounds like this. When he heard this song, I have the sense that he must have felt like some kind of musical variant of Sir Isaac Newton with this apple bouncing off his head and sending him on this course which would consume him for the remaining 40 years of his life. And he was so excited by this unfamiliar music that he wrote to his sister again back in Pozsony. And he said, I have a plan now to collect the finest examples of Hungarian folk song and raise them to the level of works of art with the best possible piano accompaniment. Such a collection would serve the purpose of acquainting the outside world with Hungarian folk music. Our own good Hungarians are much more satisfied with the usual gypsy slop. So he called up his friend Zoltán Kodály, and he had gone to school with him, and since that point he had gotten his PhD in strophic folk song structures. And they decided that the thing to do was to go off into the hinterlands of rural Hungary and to collect folk music and to study it and to base their new style of music on this music. And for Bartók, this penchant for collecting and classifying was nothing new, because ever since the time that he was a young boy, he had had this almost religious devotion to the world around him, the natural world. And he expressed that by collecting butterflies and beetles and insects of all kinds and shells. And it was something that was so important to him, and it maintained itself throughout his life. And finally, when he left Hungary in 1940 and came to this country, he continued to collect bugs, even in New York and New Jersey, and he arranged them in these containers, and some of them are on exhibit now in this Bartók exhibit in the Memorial House in Budapest. These are some of Bartók's bugs. And Zoltán Kodaly commented on the effect that this penchant for collecting and classifying had on his effectiveness as a collector of folk songs. He said, alongside such knowledge of languages and such musical ability, only the collector's passion was necessary to make a large-scale folklorist out of anyone. In collecting folk songs, Bartok achieved a synthesis of 4 basic ideas at the core of his overall philosophy: nature, man, freedom, and the world of instincts. He regarded folk songs as a natural phenomenon, and nature was the fundamental basis of his entire human and moral outlook in life. So he and Kodály really regarded themselves as scientists, as ethnomusicologists, the first of the real musical scientists. And they had chosen as their field of study this branch of nature, which was folk songs. And so they trundled out into the hinterlands of Greater Hungary, carrying these wind-up antique, now they're antique, Edison wax cylinder recording machines. And this was quite an adventure for him, for Bartok. He was an urban person, and yet here he was out in the wilds. And it was required a thick skin. And he spoke about this experience in a letter that he wrote later to a friend. He said, "It would probably be difficult for you to imagine the great amount of toil and labor connected with our work of collection. In order to secure musical material uninfluenced by urban culture, we had to travel to villages as far as possible removed from urban centers and lines of communication. In order to obtain older songs perhaps centuries old, we had to turn to older people, old women in particular, whom quite naturally it was difficult to get to sing. They were often afraid of the phonograph, as they had never in their lives seen such a monster. Yet, despite all of this, I must admit that those days which I spent in the villages among the peasants were the happiest days of my life." And they continued this process of collecting out in the hinterlands for about 12 years, from 1906 until about 1918 at the end of the war. And then the Treaty of Trianon redrew the boundaries of Greater Hungary, and suddenly they were unable to go to these places anymore. They couldn't cross the borders. And so he spent the remainder of his life taking these literally thousands of songs that they had collected and organizing them and studying them and classifying them. And he organized them into 3 basic areas. You have the old style songs, the new style songs, and the mixed style songs. And of these 3 categories, the one that most fascinated him were the old style songs, because they seemed like a conduit into some utopian ancient Hungary that he was going to use as the basis of this new style of music that he was composing. I'll play you an example of an old style song. Before I do, you have to understand this tune I'm about to play for you was recorded in the fields 108 years ago. And the sound is scratchy. I mean, you'll hear the turning of the wax cylinder and the needle biting into it. There's a lot of distortion, but you'll get used to it as we listen to these, and you'll listen underneath it, and you hear the spirit of these people is so strong and so well represented, even though they are antique recordings. Also, in line with his notion of himself as an ethnomusicologist, he transcribed these tunes physically as well, because when he would have these people sing the songs for him, he quickly discovered that every time they sang them, they came out differently. And so he wanted to record all of the possible variants, and this he had to do by writing them down. So let me write, I chose a song for you to begin, which is about leaving Hungary, which is what happened to him. And it's this nostalgic song, and it's written in a style which is called Parlando rubato. I will describe that in just a minute, but here's the tune. was fascinated by this kind of music because it's so free and the words are so intimately interwoven with the music. It's got this, it's not metrical, it's something completely different than what he was used to hearing. And he was also fascinated by the purely instrumental music that he heard out there in the rural areas. And occasionally he was lucky enough to find somebody who would sing a song and then play it again on whatever instrument he happened to have at hand. I'll play you a recording of a gentleman who he refers to only as an elderly man, but I think a rather lusty and spirited old guy. You'll hear this borderline ribald song that he's singing, and when he's finished, he plays it again on his bagpipe, on his doodle sack. I love listening to these. The spirit of these people comes across so clearly and undimmed by the ages and by this antique recording technology. You feel like you learn so much about them. There was the so-called new style songs that he recorded, and we hear a lot of examples of that on Tuesday night in the violin duos that he wrote. He wrote a lot of pedagogical music. These were written in 1931 as pedagogical pieces, and they are a little bit more regular, most of them, in their rhythm and in their organization. The style of music that in 1906, when he started to record these, that he poo-pooed, that he didn't really have much regard for, were the so-called mixed songs, because they showed too much of the influence of urban culture and of modern culture and this cross-pollination with European music. And that was what he was trying to get away from. This was a utopian mission that he was on. And he was going to use these, he called them precious stones that he had unearthed in the hinterlands, as the basis of this new style of original music making. And he eventually outlined a prescription of ways that he would do that. I'll describe them to you. The simplest way was you could take the precious stone itself and just set it, which is to say, everything under it, the ring of the music, was there just to highlight the peasant song itself. A slightly more sophisticated way was you would take the characteristics of that precious stone, and out of that you would set the setting, and it would be drawn out of what he had learned from analyzing the characteristics of that stone. After he and Kodály had lived with these and recorded thousands of them, they got to the point where they could write their own imitation, sort of zirconian versions of them. But the ultimate direction of this was to write completely original music, which was permeated by the atmosphere, the modes, the spirit, the rhythms, and yet wouldn't necessarily use peasant songs, original or zirconian, as the basis of them. And that, of course, is what happened. In 1906, he and Kodály released their first publication of 20 folk songs. And they set them with piano accompaniment, and Bartók set 10 of them, and Kodály set 10 of them. And they are pretty much in this 1A category, because what he's trying to do with these early settings is to make them palatable to the Hungarian public. He wants them to like them, and so they are set faithfully. You hear the diamond itself there is as he records it, and yet the settings are simple, and they're just there to support it in a way that will be recognizably almost westernized. I'll play you an example. This is a recording of a tune called Abla Comba, which means at my window, at my window. And many of these tunes are They're about basic human experiences. This one is about a woman who's standing, looking out of her window at night, staring at the moon, lamenting about her lover, who is a farmhand who has forsaken her and has betrayed her with pretty much everybody else in the town. So he sets that tune, and as you'll hear in his setting, he doubles the tune in the right hand just to reinforce it. In the left hand, he plays a series of simple chordal accompaniments on the offbeats. He adheres mostly to the mode in which this piece is written. It's not major or minor, it's Aeolian, which is, it's like a minor scale with a flat 7th degree, which means that you can't really write a proper dominant chord, and so he tries to avoid them. But at the end, he begins to interpolate some Western-sounding harmonies. I've circled some of them, the notes that go outside of this mode in red, just so you can see them go by, because he wants, again, for this music to be palatable. So here is his setting of that tune. As you hear, he maintains everything about the tune itself, that he's faithful to the tune. But he wanted to be more faithful to the modes as well, and within a short period, he wrote in one of his essays, "The outcome of my studies was of decisive influence upon my work because it freed me from the tyrannical rule of major and minor keys. It became clear to me that the old modes, which had been forgotten in our music, had lost none of their vigor." And so the following year, in 1907, he went down to Transylvania in the Czech district, and he recorded more songs, and when he came back, he sent 8 of them with piano accompaniments. And here we begin to hear that he's drawing out of these precious stones the qualities that will become a part of the accompaniments. They become more of that motto style, that 1B, I guess, in that prescription. I'll play you the tune. This was sung by a 15-year-old girl named Anna Doja. It's another lament about lost love, and she seems to know what she's talking about. So he takes a look at the structure of this piece. He finds out what the scale is, which is pentatonic. Just those 5 notes. And pentatonic scales, as they relate to folk music, are interesting because music, the worldwide folk music, is based on pentatonic scales. You see them in Appalachian folk song, you see them in rural Hungarian folk song, you see them in Chinese and Japanese and Javanese folk pieces. Bruce Adolph, who you all know, calls it the Sino-Appalachian scale, I think. And if you take these 5 notes and you play them simultaneously, you get that sound. If you just play the E minor 7 chord, then you hear what he does with this. He writes a prelude, he writes a postlude, and he basically just uses this rippling E minor 7 drawn from the structure of the song itself as the accompaniment. I will play you a recording that he himself made 22 years later in 1929. Quality that Anna Doja invested in their performance is there, and everything about it is the same. It just has this accompaniment which glorifies the song. That same year of 1907, he was invited to become a member of the piano faculty at Budapest Conservatory, and he started to make his first pedagogical arrangements, and also he began to set purely instrumental folk songs that he had recorded also down in that cheap district of Transylvania. I'll play you one of these, which was recorded on a shepherd flute, and I will need some tutoring later in pronouncing this. I think it's called the fruda. It's a simple stick with holes drilled into it. He just came across somebody out there in the rural hinterlands who played the instrument, and he wrote it down very quickly. You'll see how scratchy, and it sounds almost shapeless, this recording on this simple shepherd flute. Listen to how he treats it in his piano arrangement. It has this very haunting, poignant quality, and he preserved all of those parlando, rubato qualities. This year of 1907 was a very eventful year for him because his friend Kodály went off to Paris, met with Debussy, studied with him a little bit, came back bearing scores for Bartók to analyze and to play. And Bartók was blown away by what he saw in these scores because it so reinforced what he was doing in Budapest at that time, and he wrote about it later in his autobiographical statement. He said, "I was greatly surprised to find in Debussy's work pentatonic phrases similar in character to those contained in peasant music. It seems, therefore, that in our age, modern music has developed along similar lines in countries geographically far away from each other. It has become rejuvenated under the influence of a kind of peasant music that has remained untouched by the musical creations of the last centuries." And to give you an example of the kind of thing he's talking about, you may know the piano prelude that Debussy wrote, which is called The Sunken Cathedral. The beginning of it begins with this pentatonic scale based on G. And he harmonizes it not with conventional triads of thirds, but with unconventional triads of fourths and fifths, which gives this opening section this shimmering effect of this castle sunken at the bottom of the lake. As you hear, it's 4 bars long. The second two bars are the same as the first bar. The only difference is the bass line goes from down to F. And what that does is it means that we're now in the Lydian mode. And throughout this, Debussy uses modes and pentatonic scales. He uses the Phrygian mode later on. And at the climax of the piece, Debussy uses a series of sequential dominant seven chords. He just uses them purely for their sensuous effect. We don't hear them resolve. He takes what used to be regarded as dissonant chords and he turns them into consonant chords like a jazz musician would. All of this was very inspiring and reinforcing for Bartók because he was doing so many of the same things, using pentatonic scales, using modes, using non-traditional uses of harmony. And the following year, 1908, he wrote some pieces which I think show some of the influence of Debussy. We have a set of bagatelles, 14 of them that he wrote in 1908, and they really are groundbreaking pieces because they were unlike anything he or anybody had ever written before, and they were a kind of a crucible in which he worked out the implications of these uses of folk music. Some of them are purely settings of folk tunes that he had recorded around that time. The majority of them are purely original pieces that draw their atmosphere and their techniques from the folk music that he had been discovering and analyzing. It will be fun sometime to talk about these pieces because he was using the techniques that he worked out 40 years later in these pieces written in 1908. But since there isn't really time for that, I'll just play you a bit of the fourth. Here's the tune upon which it is based. It's a recording of a gentleman that he made this in a district called Tolna in 1907. It's a kind of a Hungarian cowboy song. To its scale structure. It's written in essentially the D Aeolian mode, which is like a minor scale with a flat seventh. But most of the notes are drawn from the D pentatonic scale. And you'll hear he uses those as the basis, those pentatonic notes as the basis of his left hand. And the right hand is very much like what Debussy did in the Sunken Cathedral. You've got sequential chords used purely for their effect. In the first phrase, triads, mostly minor triads. In the second phrase, which melodically is the same as the first, minor seventh chords used, again, sequentially, just like Debussy did. At the very end, he leaves the mode and the pentatonic scale and he interpolates a G sharp and an F sharp, which clash with that, which gives you the sense of lament and pain that you would feel if your cows had wandered away at the middle of the night. of the pieces in this set, these bagatelles, are purely original pieces that draw their language, which this whole thing is becoming a mother tongue to him, from folk song influences. And the pieces that he was writing at this time on a larger scale also incorporated folk song influences. And as an example of that, in 1911, he wrote his one and only opera, Bluebeard's Castle. And it starts out with a prologue. You have a bard who strides out onto the stage, and he welcomes us into this mysterious, ancient, haunted realm of Bluebeard's Castle. In order to evoke that ancient, mysterious, haunted realm, he uses an ancient pentatonic scale, beginning on an F sharp. And you'll hear in this prologue with the bard speaking, the undercurrent is all strings playing only on those 5 notes.
Urak, asszonyságok! Zene szól, a láng ég, kezdődjön a játék, szemed pillás függönye fent, táncoljatok, majd ha lement, urak, asszonyságok! Régi már, az mese, ki róla jár. Ti is hallgassátok.
I envy those of you who speak this language. It's such an evocative sound. This opera didn't do so well when he wrote it. He hoped that it would be produced immediately. He submitted it to the Ferenc Ercole competition. They set it aside. They didn't like it. And this made him despondent, and he settled into a period of relative fallowness when compositionally speaking. But he maintained his schedule of going off into the hinterlands and recording folk music. And during that time, he found himself in an area of Transylvania where the culture was Romanian, in a Romanian enclave. And he recorded a lot of purely instrumental folk music. And in 1915, he set them in a suite of Romanian folk dances, which have become very popular. You probably will recognize them. In 1917, he orchestrated them, and I'm sure that you will recognize them. What you may not have realized was how closely he hews to the sound of the instrumental performances that he recorded around 1912, 1914. I've put together a little collage here of some of these tunes as he recorded them and as he set them. And you'll hear he simply takes these uncut diamonds and he polishes them up a bit. arranged for orchestra in, I think, 1917, 1918. The war ended, he was unable to go to these places anymore. And so from that point on, he continued to make folk song settings, but they were from songs that he had recorded earlier, before the war and before these restrictions. As the 1920s came about, his music began to flirt more and more with the outer limits of tonality, inspired perhaps a bit by what Schoenberg was doing. But he was not an atonalist or even a bitonalist by nature. He thought that atonality ran against nature, based on what it was that he had learned from studying these songs. He felt that if you wanted to use all 12 notes, you had to figure out a way to do it using folk song mode. So, for instance, you could take the Lydian mode, and you could take the Phrygian mode, starting on the same note, and that gives you all 12 notes. He calls that the Lydian, Phrygian poly mode. Now, in 1920, he took songs that he had recorded before, 8 of them, and he set them to music in what he called 8 improvisations. And with these, he really is at the outer limit of setting these old songs in fairly atonal ways. He said of these, I reached, I believe, the extreme limit in adding daring accompaniments to simple folk tunes. I'll play you one of these tunes. This was recorded by a lady named Mrs. Adam Vashkoda. And it's interesting, as you watch his transcription, you'll notice there are green arrows pointing up here and there, which I guess indicate that he wanted to capture her microtonal tuning. He respected the way she was singing it. To me, it sounds like maybe she was just tone deaf. Anyway, tone deaf or not, he respected the tune, he respected what she sang, and he said it. Again, you'll hear the tune itself is lovingly preserved, just the way she sings it, same tempo, same notes. And yet, the setting of it is really in left field. It sounds like Hungarian Charles Ives now, with a lot of chords based on perfect fourths and a rather slippery tonality. Until about 1924, whenever he used folk tunes, he made it clear where he had mined them from. Here is an index from a piece he wrote in 1918, his 15 Hungarian folk songs. And as you'll see, he includes the tunes, he shows you where he recorded them, what year he collected them. In 1928-29, he wrote his 2 violin rhapsodies. And I'm going to talk as the final offering of this encounter about the first movement of the first of the rhapsodies, because I think in a way it's a kind of culmination of his desire to integrate folk elements into larger structures that are not really folk song arrangements. In these tunes, in these larger pieces, he takes authentic folk songs and he uses them as the basis of the thematic material, but he sets it in a larger structure. These were recorded around 1914 and before, and he was uncharacteristically evasive about where he had recorded these tunes. And finally, a friend of his said, "Where did you record these tunes?" And he said, "The 2 rhapsodies contain melodies from various sources. I intentionally did not indicate the sources, so I restrict myself to saying to you that number 1 uses Romanian and Hungarian melodies. QED. And that's unusual for him. And I think perhaps one of the reasons he does that is because he recorded these in the Secca district of Transylvania, which is a bastion of ancient rural Hungarian culture. And yet the musicians whom he recorded were Romanian folk musicians. Some of them were gypsies. I'll play you the tune as he recorded it, which forms the basis of the first tune in the first Violin Rhapsody, recorded by... Now, if that sounds familiar, I'll show you the setting that he uses. When he puts it into the piece itself, it sounds like this. All kinds of changes, uncharacteristic, different than what we've seen so far. He's always been so careful to honor everything about the tune. Now he's changed the tempo. Popovisi plays it quickly, he plays it slowly and deliberately with a kind of heroic quality. He adds all of these double stops which highlight and kind of italicize the rusticity of the tune and violate some of its integrity as a piece of Romanian folk music. At the end you see this 7th that Popovisi plays is changed into a little ornamental hiccup. And that's more characteristic of Hungarian folk music, and you hear that in the Hari János suite of Kodály all over the place. And maybe most significantly, he even changes the mode. I mean, Popovisi plays it in a Romanian Lydian mode. But when he sets it with a B flat at the top rather than a B natural, which implies that old Hungarian gypsy scale, which is unusual. And he calls it a de siuit, which means a calling to the dance. And when asked, what is it? What kind of classification? He said it's very close to the old gypsy verbalposh style of writing. So here he is, he's writing this in 1929. He is close to 50 years old. And he seems to be saying, perhaps under it, that in order for a society or a culture to be healthy, it has to integrate foreign influences, foreign stimuli. He has up until this point been so concerned with pure sources, and now he seems to be breaking that utopian bubble in favor of a more unfettered kind of internationalism. And lest you think I'm just making this up, a couple of years later, in 1931, he gave a speech, and he said, my creative work, just because it arises from 3 sources, Hungarian, Romanian, and Slovakian, might be understood as the embodiment of the very concept of integration so much emphasized in Hungary today. My own idea is a brotherhood of peoples in spite of all wars and conflicts. I try, to the best of my ability, to serve this idea in my music. So he is really embracing a kind of internationalism here. And as the final offering of this encounter, I'd like to play you the full first movement of this piece. Before I do, you've heard the first melody. I'll play you the second melody. And this was recorded even before Bartok by a predecessor of his, whose name was Béla Vikar, and it is a gypsy violinist playing what he turned into the second theme of this first rhapsody, first movement. So now, in the remaining 4 minutes of this encounter, I'll play you the first movement. This recording was made live 74 years ago at the Library of Congress. You have the great Hungarian violinist Joseph Zsigeti, and you have the great Hungarian pianist Béla Bartók. Thank you very much.